So today's talk is on memory, forgetting, and dementia, with the subtitle, What is Human Memory and Why Do We Forget? As an outline for the talk, I'm going to broach this rather amorphous subject, what is memory? And I'm not really going to tell you that much to begin with, because as you will see, memory is vast and it defies explanation, really. So it's going to take me some time. I'm going to look at some popular questions to do with memory while I go into what memory is. And then the thing that everyone is effectively interested in, what is forgetting? Then I'll talk about whether memory is one thing or more. And effectively, by looking at these questions like what is forgetting and is memory one thing, I'll be describing the complexity of human memory. And then I'm going to move into the area that I'm extremely passionate about, which is what neurological disorders result in forgetting. And that will segue into the next frontier, which is dementia. And when I started working on the talk yesterday, I realized that there was no way I could do justice to this field. I fell in love with this area 30 years ago as an undergraduate, and it's the most fascinating area of neuropsychology. And I realized that I couldn't do justice to this vast area in one talk. So in fact, the dementia work is going to come in the second talk. So this is a bit of a teaser. But just as a preface, one of the important things I want to talk about next in the next talk, I don't know whether it'll be next week or the week after, will be about the fact that everyone equates dementia with Alzheimer's, and they're seen as interchangeable terms, but that's not the case at all. Alzheimer's is the most known dementia, but there are other dementias as well, such as vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, etc. And so what I want to do in the talk next time is to delve into that a bit more, to demonstrate that forgetting does not equate to dementia, does not equate to Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia, but there are other forms of dementia. And dementia is not the same as forgetting. Dementia results in forgetting, but it results in other things as well. And that's why it's the next frontier, because it is something that we're only just scratching the surface of. And as a teaser and a preview, I've given you this lovely cartoon by my new friend Tony Husband, who is a satirist and cartoonist for the Private Eye and publications like that, but who suffered from or experienced the issue of dementia through his father, who got dementia and who passed away eventually. And Tony has created an amazing book, which is cartoons of him depicting dementia to a lay audience. And it's a wonderful book. And so I'll be talking about Tony's work next time, because I think it's really important that we hear different voices for understanding this condition. And in fact, Tony and I are now pairing up so that we're going to be giving talks where the artist, him, and the scientist, me, do dementia, basically, because he's going to give the personal view on seeing his father's dementia and visualize it through cartoons. And then I'm going to help the audience understand what the science of dementia is telling us at the moment. So that will be for next time. Okay, so what is this thing called memory? Memory is possibly the most complex part of cognitive psychology, which is basically all our mental processes, because it involves everything. And the reason I've called this cake, smell, and literature is because of these little cakey things called madeleines, which are originally French cakes. And they're referred to by this dashing young man called Marcel Proust, who was an author who wrote this book, À la recherche du temps perdu, which is remembrance of things past. And in this book, there's a moment where he talks about smelling these smelling Madeleine cakes, and how, as an adult, smelling these Madeleine cakes suddenly took him back to moments when he was younger, and I think when he was visiting his aunt, and he could visualize being there as a child at his aunt's home, about to eat these Madeleine cakes. And what that, there's a beautiful section in it. I'm not going to pretend that I've read the book. I've just seen this particular passage. What that passage shows us is the complexity of memory and effectively its function. Memory is really important for us for giving us a connection to ourselves and our past and to other people. So, for example, I know that when some questions are asked later on, because I've got the memory of a very old she-elephant, I'll know whether the people who are asking me the questions were here at last week's talk, and I will remember that. And what that does is it gives me a connection to my own past from last Saturday, and it also gives me a connection to those people who've spent time listening to my talk and sending in a question. And we all know how memory connects us to our families, etc. So memory is this incredibly important skill, which helps us in so many different ways. I'm going to share with you some videos of some people who've lost their memories to give you a sense of the tragedy that can occur as a result of losing your memory. So this is just a preface for how important memory is. So one of the important things is, why do we forget? Which is kind of counterintuitive, that I should be asking this just after telling you how good memory is and why it's so important. Now, a person that we've got to thank for this is a German philosopher and scientist called Ebbinghaus. And Ebbinghaus had noticed that if he thought about things that he'd done a couple of minutes ago, those memories seemed to be quite fresh. Whereas if he thought about something that was a few hours ago, they were less fresh. And if he went back a few days, it was even weaker, a few weeks weaker, a few months, few years later, a few years still weaker. And so effectively he noticed this thing, and being a bit of a scientist, he did an experiment to look at this objectively. And this intuition that he had about the fact that the further back into time he went, the weaker those memories became, he was able to demonstrate that. And this curve, where you've got on the x-axis, on the horizontal x-axis, time from minutes ago through to hours ago, days ago, etc. And on the y-axis, along the side there, the vertical axis, you've got how much you remember. What we see is that unless you've got major amnesia, your memory for a couple of minutes ago is really good, and it's much better than yesterday, which is much better than a few weeks ago, etc. Now, that is a fact. Ebbinghaus was no different to any of us. His memory is your memory as well. So there must be a reason for this. And the reason is that from a point of evolution and survival, this current moment is much more important to me than yesterday, because I might have learned something since yesterday that's really important to me today. So if I can remember the things today that I've learned since yesterday, then it's better that I can remember today better than yesterday. So effectively, there's a really important aspect of forgetting, that the current moment is more important and relevant to us than one that was yesterday or 3 days ago or a week ago, etc. Because our current experience is effectively our best moment in a way. So forgetting is a natural phenomenon, and it's important for us. There was someone studied by the great Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria, who had a patient, I can't remember what his name was, but he wrote a book about this patient. And if I remember correctly, this patient was shown a blackboard of 100 random digits written on the blackboard. And 10 years later, the patient could remember all of those digits. Now, some of you might say, wow, that's amazing to be able to remember all of that 10 years later. I'd think, good grief, that'd be terrible. Because I want today to be a fresh memory. Some awful thing that happened a few months ago, I want to have forgotten that. So today needs to be clearer than yesterday. So there is a protective factor to our memory fading with time, because if we're enjoying our lives, then today should be the most important thing. And in a way, this links in very vaguely, but it does link into things like post-traumatic stress and things like that, where people can't forget these stressful moments. And it shows how that forgetting is actually a protective thing. So this Ebbinghaus forgetting of memory getting weaker as we go further back in time is completely normal. Now, this takes me to a question that I'm asked often, and you will have pondered it yourself, that why is your parent or your grandparent's memory for when they were children so much better than something from last week? Because it goes against what I've just said. What I've just said is that yesterday is less important than today. A year ago is less clear than today, etc. So as we go further back in time, we should get weaker and weaker memories. So why is it that the grandmother has got really good memories for her teens and early 20s? And in the research literature, this is known as the reminiscence bump. And I know about this because this is what my PhD, my doctorate, was about many moons ago. And I was looking at why it is that this happens. This graph here is a tiny bit complicated, but what I've got on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is a person's age, which starts on the left-hand side with them being 0 years old, so when they were born, and on the right-hand side, them today. And in this particular graph, I've been looking at people who are in their late 50s. Now, what you see, and on the y-axis along the vertical, what we see is how good someone's memory is. Now, what we see, I don't know if you can see my my cursor moving around here, is this slanting going backwards. That's just like the Ebbinghaus curve, that recent memories are stronger than 5 years ago, which is stronger than 5 years ago, etc., etc. So that is the standard Ebbinghaus forgetting. But what we see with these older people is that there's this bump. These memories from this earlier point in life seem to be really strong. So this has become known as the reminiscence bump, that our memories fade as we go further back in time like this, but we have this really good memory, if we're of a certain age, from the younger part of our lives, mainly the late teens and early 20s. And then all of us have this bit here, this drop to almost zero for the first 5 years of life. That first 5 years, that's known as infantile amnesia. And we all have that because our memory processes aren't actually formed when we're born. It takes us some time, and the earliest memories most of us have are from the age of 3, 4, 5 years of age, just because memory as we know it as adults hasn't yet fully formed. So if we take that away, the main thing is that we've got this reminiscence bump, these really good strong memories from the teens and early 20s. And that's why your parent or grandparent will have these really good memories because of this reminiscence bump. The reason it happens is rather interesting. I am happy to take some questions later on, but it's tiny bit complex, so I won't go into it. But an interesting thing is that this isn't just for memories from our own lives. When I was doing my PhD, I was about one of maybe 5 people in the world who was doing work in this area. So it was a bit of a lonely pursuit. But now lots of people do research in this area, and there's work that's shown that this reminiscence bump happens for all sorts of things. And this graph here is for people's rating of how much they like music. And what we've got here is recent times, so 2010 through to 1950s, and they gave people music to listen to or names of musical tracks, and they asked them how much they liked them. And what they found is that for people who were about 20 years old, they were preferring the music from the recent past. But importantly, there was a lot of memories music that they liked from when their parents were about 20 years of age, which seemed a bit odd to begin with. But the idea here is that these people whose parents were about 20 years old or in their mid-20s in the 1980s will have been playing music when they were children. And as a result of that, they became very familiar with this music, and they were then remembering that music much later on in life. And this is why you get young people who like music by people who died many moons ago, and you wonder, how do you know that music? And it's usually because their parents have been playing that music, and that music represents music from the reminiscence area of their own parents. Music isn't the only area where this has happened. Weirdly, it's happened with football as well. So in this rather interesting study conducted in Holland, what the researchers did was that they wanted to, I think they had about 600 men, I think, who liked football, and they of different ages, and they asked them, who do you think was the greatest footballer of all time? And they gave them some choices, but they also let them choose their own the names of footballers that they particularly liked. But the 3 footballers that came out top were the Brazilian Pelé, the Dutch master Johan Cruyff, and the Argentinian Diego Maradona. Now, interestingly, what they did is that they looked at the age of the individual, the participant, at the high point of each player's career. And what they found is that by and large, the age of those 600 guys was generally around 17 years of age. That was the peak age. So what was happening is that these guys who were in that reminiscence period, just like the granny here, they had these really strong and emotional memories of that period of their lives, such that years later, 20 years later, if you ask them who was the greatest footballer, they would say the person from that period when they were about 17 to 20 years of age. So the idea is that if you asked a young man today who's the greatest footballer, they wouldn't say these Pelé, Cruyff, etc., because they would choose someone from their own reminiscence period. So what that suggests is that there's something happening in this period, our late teens and early 20s, which results in memory being extremely strong. And that's what my PhD was about, that why is it that we remember things from this period of life so well? And I'm happy to take questions about it later on. Basically, a short answer is that that period of life is a period where we're doing a lot of things for the first time. There's a lot of psychological change. We're becoming adults, where some of us are going to university. We're doing many things for the first time, independent holidays, first loves, etc. And the memory system is effectively not overpowered. It's getting lots of amazing new experiences. And unfortunately, as we get older, those things get repeated, but not as well as those early experiences. The next example of forgetting is coming from a slightly different angle, and it's to do with where remembering where you were when very famous things happened. Excuse me. So I know that we've got a variety of ages represented in the audience, but for those of you who are old enough, can you remember where you were and what you were doing when you found out that JFK was shot? Some of you I know are old enough and will know the horror that especially Americans felt when they heard this. I can even remember where I was stood when I heard that Elvis had died. And I remember waking up my older sister to tell her that I just heard that Elvis Presley had died. When the space shuttle Challenger exploded on launch, those who were watching it remember the horror of this thing happening. I remember the day finding out that Diana, Princess of Wales, had been in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris, and I can remember finding out and wondering whether it was true, etc., etc. I can remember exactly where I was when I found out that two planes had crashed into the Twin Towers in New York. Now, all of these are known as flashbulb memories, and they're studied a lot by researchers because in the early days of memory research, there was a thought that these flashbulb memories were, given the term, this is why, I've spelled JFK wrong. I'm sorry, I was tired. Flashbulb memories, they were given that name because of those of you who are old enough. Do you remember when you had a camera with a flash thing on the top and it rotated every time it flashed? So flashbulb memory was this idea that you took an instant photograph of how you felt, because everyone can say it's as clear as day. I remember when this happened. And a question that researchers wanted to ask was, are those memories like a flashbulb? Do we effectively take a picture and store it in our memories such that if I ask you, where were you, can you remember finding out about 9/11? Are you actually recalling a photographic memory of that event, or is it something else? And there's been lots of lovely research on this. And I think the best research was done by this amazing man next to me. This is Professor William Hurst, who is a professor at the New School in New York. He is easily the most intelligent person I've ever met, and one of the nicest. And he's had a profound impact on my career. And he's done research in memory that's been stunning, and those of you who've studied memory will know about Miller's magic number 7 plus or minus 2. Well, Bill studied with Miller, and Bill studied with some of the greats. Now, when 9/11 happened, Bill has lived in New York for 50 odd years. He did this remarkable thing where, because he knows all of the greats of the memory world, he created a research study literally just like that. And within a couple of days, he had an army of researchers going out onto the streets of New York to ask people what they remember about that moment. So as it was happening, they were effectively getting people's memories of that event. And if flashbulb memories are indeed this photographic memory, which you can then subsequently remember 10 years later, etc., then it's a case of closing your eyes, remembering the photograph, and then reeling off your information, etc. Now, because of the way that Bill designed this amazing study, they were able to go back and check each person's memory against their own initial memory. So they could see if Barbara said blah, 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 or, just after that horrific event, then 5 years later, they could go back to Barbara's memory of when it happened and compare her memory 5 years later. And the simple question it was, if it's a flashbulb and it's an exact photographic copy, then there shouldn't be any difference between what Barbara says today and what she said when the event happened. Now, initially, this is the first data I'm going to show you. And this was the confidence rating of Barbara and all the 2,000 odd people that they studied. S2 stands for this second memory of it. So the first memory was when it happened. S2 was 5 years later, I think, S3 maybe 8 years later, and S4 10 years later. And here, what Bill and his team did was to ask Barbara and all of the other 1,900 people, how confident are you about how strong your memory was of that particular event? And they said, if you think that your memory is rubbish for what happened, then say 1. If you think it's crystal clear as if it was yesterday, then say 5. And we see that Barbara and all the other people at stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4, and stage 4 was 10 years later, they were giving ratings of at least 4. So they were saying they were really confident of what they were saying. This is the consistency of Barbara's memory and all the other people. And here on the y-axis, you've got the proportion of consistency. So effectively, this is what Barbara says today compared to what Barbara said originally. So at stage 1, stage 2, and stage 4, 10 years later. And the important thing here is that while Barbara seems to be really confident here that her memory is really good of the 9/11 attacks, what you see here is that her memory is actually about 60% accurate. So it's not bad, but certainly not 100%. So what that demonstrates is that we can have these extremely clear memories, or our idea is that they're extremely clear, but in fact, they're not as clear as we think they are. At the last talk, I described the fact that memory is a reconstructive process and that we're not actually remembering a copy of our previous memory. We're actually remembering what we think we remember. And so the work that Bill did with his team on these flashbulb memories of 9/11 really nicely demonstrate that memory is constantly fading. The next thing I want to go into is that we have that as a general everyday memory forgetting thing, but memory can have problems for neurological and other reasons. And I just want to give you a sense of how complicated this is. Memory can go wrong for 2 main reasons. Psychogenic, which is psychological problem, psychological trauma. And last time I talked about psychogenic fugue, where there's an emotional shutdown of the system because of emotional trauma. And I'm not going to go into that this time. I'm going to concentrate on organic memory problems. Organic memory problems They break down into two different types, known as transient and permanent. Now, transient, as the name implies, is that it's for a temporary amount of time and it's not forever. These terms, if people are interested, I can talk about later: transient global amnesia, electroconvulsive therapy, and post-traumatic amnesia. Permanent amnesia is where the problem that people experience will stay with them. And that breaks down into two different types, degenerative and stable. So stable is where it's not going to get any worse. It's bad, but it's not going to get any worse. Whereas degenerative disorders, that's a whole host of different problems. So SDAT stands for senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type. So Alzheimer's basically, but that's part of the group of dementias. There's Huntington's, PICS. When HIV turns into AIDS, so not when someone is HIV positive, but when that goes into full-blown AIDS, at the time when this was happening, thankfully it's not happening as much these days, there are memory problems, and these are degenerative. They're getting worse over time. Whereas stable disorders, can be material specific, and these include things like problems with just faces or just places or just objects. And some of you may remember that I gave a talk a few weeks ago about face recognition, the man who mistook his neuropsychologist for a pop star. So that was an example of a face-specific memory problem. With the global problems, there's a whole host, and I'm not going to tell you what all of these are. I'm happy to answer questions because I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. Okay, so having told you that memory can go wrong because of physical problems and psychological ones, I now want to move to a rather important question, which is whether memory is one thing or it's many things. So the question, the way I get students to think about this is to say, let's think about a bicycle. When did you last ride a bicycle? What is a bicycle? And how do you ride a bicycle? And the question I pose is, do all of these questions, given that they're about bicycles, require one type of information, or are they calling on different types of information? And the way that I'm going to address that is by showing you this video of a man called Clive Waring, who used to be a BBC classical musician, and he unfortunately contracted a virus called herpes simplex encephalitis, which is a nasty, nasty virus. And a video was made, or a documentary by the great Jonathan Miller, in which called Prison of Consciousness, in which Clive is shown in a nursing home that he has to live in, and you see Clive writing in a diary, and at some point you'll see it will zoom into his diary. What you want to look at is whether Clive can remember writing something earlier that day. Then you'll see him greeting his wife, and you'll see the reaction that he has. And then finally, let's see whether he can play the piano. Now, this is a very, very, very old video, and it's about a fifth-hand copy from VHS to VHS to digitizing, etc. To those of you who know what those terms mean, and so it's quite grainy, and the quality isn't great, but it's made up for in terms of content.
At the time when these pictures were taken, Clive was in full possession of all his faculties. In fact, he had a good memory and exceptional skills in music. A brain scan would have shown no abnormalities whatsoever. In March 1985, the previously inactive virus of herpes simplex suddenly began to multiply inside his nervous system. It attacked and irreversibly damaged certain parts of his brain. The right temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and in particular the left temporal lobe. All these areas became scarred, and the holes filled up with fluid. After this almost fatal illness, physical health returned to normal, except for occasional seizures which take the form of belching. But Clive is left with a dense and almost impenetrable amnesia. When did you actually start this diary procedure? Was it his idea or was it yours?
Well, I had noticed he started writing on bits of paper by the bed, and it wasn't until about October last year that he began to use the diary and note down the time of day all the time. It's a chronology of the day, simply. Because he's in a constant state of thinking he's just woken up and won't acknowledge that he's been awake before, even if he sees it in his own handwriting.
But otherwise, the diary itself has no content at all. You see, here we have Tuesday, May the 13th, which was the day that we started filming with him. He says 9:23, awake first time, builder's noise is be awful. And that was in fact when he was distressed when we first came, because he'd been upset by the noise. Now the interesting thing is there's an entry for 10:23, awake, playing cards elsewhere. The next entry is 12:55, and there's actually no record of what happened in that previous 2 hours. Now, if you remember, between 10:23 and 12:55, we were doing that filming in the hospital chapel with the choir. Although Clive had seen his wife earlier that morning, he greeted her as if it was the first time in years.
Come and sit down.
It was like dying and being dead.
I'm not dead.
It feels like it. I've never seen you touch anything. What's it like? What's it like when you're dead, you know?
I haven't tried it, sweetie.
No, have I? I don't know whether any consciousness actually transferred to it, but if you now see anything, there's anything I've touched, not the sense of being in connection with anything at all, you're exactly like being dead.
I know. Kiss a kiss. It's lovely to see you.
It's wonderful to see you. You've no idea how much better it is to see you.
Look, I've got an organ.
I used to play it.
Did you?
Yes, when I was a kid.
Do you want to open it? I'll switch it on.
Have you played at all?
Yes.
What?
Yes. You played quite a lot.
Really?
Mm. We've got some friends here, actually. You could sing something with you. No?
That's too
No.
much.
I'll get you some keyboard music. You twiddle around a bit. Okay. Who's here?
It's hard to say whether the broad smile with which he greets a member of his old choir really means that he recognizes her.
You're not still, are you, then? You look wonderful.
Perhaps awfully well is what I mean.
Linda would sing something with you, because you know how my voice is.
Will you be a...
Do
you know... How about that one? Okay.
Okay, so I know it's quite long, but I hope that the length of the video was worth it, because you see there that Clive developed this virus, herpes simplex encephalitis, which a lot of us have. It's just dormant, so it's asleep. But for reasons that aren't well understood, that virus can wake up, and once it wakes up, if it's not understood, what it just wreaks havoc. And because it looks like the common cold or a flu at the beginning, what happens is that it can be treated or mistreated as that. And I know that maybe one of the patients I've worked with in the past, Sandra, might be listening in, and she had the same virus. The thing is that if it's missed as what it is, the encephalitis, and instead people think it's the flu, it's treated as the flu, and all the time that this is being misdiagnosed, the virus is making killing more and more brain cells. So it's kind of like a misdiagnosis of the coronavirus, that if it's misdiagnosed, then it's causing a lot of damage that by the time it's diagnosed properly, it's almost too late. And that's what happened with Clive, because he ended up with this massive brain damage, which meant that he's got this amnesia. And you noticed that, or you might have noticed that as the camera zoomed into his diary, it said 9:57 first time awake, 9:59 finally awake, 10:01 awake, 10:03 first time awake. Clive has kept diaries for the last 35 to 40 years, claiming to have just woken up. And I know the neuropsychologist Barbara Wilson, who worked with him, and whenever she visits Clive, she still sees him once a year. She talks to him, and he claims to have just woken up. And she says, "But you can't have Clive. You've written it. Look, I'll show you your diaries." And he says, "No, I can't have written those diaries because I've just woken up." And it's tragic. And this is why the video is called "A Prisoner of Consciousness," because he is a prisoner of just the moment that he can hold in his mind right now. And I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. And you see that amplified when he sees his wife, because he embraces her as if he hasn't seen her for years, because of the fact that he can't remember having seen her earlier that day. But we see him playing the piano without any problems. And anyone who's tried to play a musical instrument knows that it's a feat of memory. So what we see here are a number of different things going on in terms of memory and how long it lasts. Now, one way to look at this or understand this is from a scientific experiment known as the serial position curve, or the free recall task. And in this task, if I was to do it with you, I would give you, S stands for subject, I'd give you 20 words to remember. And I might give you a word every second, so table, apple, etc. Now, straight after I've given you the 20 words, I could ask you, just tell me every word that you can remember. And if I did that with all of you who are sat out there, let's say there's 100 of you, I could see how many of you remembered table, the first word, how many remembered apple, the second word, etc. And if we did this, what we get, and this happens wherever you do this experiment, which whether you do it with men or women, different religions, it doesn't matter, you get exactly the same results, is what's known as U-shaped curve. And along the bottom there, you've got position of the word. So table would be the first word, second word was apple, etc. And here we've got the proportion of you that, of 100 of you that would remember it. And what we see is that a lot of people would remember the first few words, table and apple, etc. There wouldn't be much good recall for the middle words, and then there'd be a lot of good recall for the last few words. Oops. And that, because we get this finding over and over and over again, irrespective of who you do the study with, we know that this represents something important in the brain. And this U-shaped curve has become really important for us understanding aspects of human memory. And a way to think about it happened with this model that was created in the 1960s by two American researchers, Atkinson and Schifrin. And since I don't want to torture you as a lecturer with this model, I'll just tell you very briefly what the model entails. They said that there were three different stages in memory. The first stage is the sensory stores, which are on the left-hand side. And this is our eyes, our fingers, our ears, etc., everything that's taking information in through our senses. Then that information goes through to a short-term store, and that short-term store can't hold a lot of information. And if we do something with that information, such as repeating it over and over again, then we might be able to transfer some of that information into long-term memory. Otherwise, if we don't hold on to it, it gets displaced or forgotten. So the idea is that short-term memory is for a little while, and then we move information to long-term memory. And this distinction between the short-term store and long-term store is supported by a lot of evidence. There's differences in how long the information lasts in there. So I said that Clive was a prisoner of consciousness. That consciousness is effectively the length of short-term memory. And at best, it's probably about 90 seconds. Anything beyond that is long-term memory. So if you were to take away one thing from this talk, it would be that short-term memory is not the last few weeks. Whenever people say, oh, my mother has got bad short-term memory, she can't remember what I told her a week ago, it infuriates me. Because I even have students saying that, and I even have other cognitive psychologists say that. That is complete balderdash. Short-term memory is literally what you can remember of what I've just said. That's it. Anything that you're trying to consciously remember after that is in your long-term memory. So let's say about the last minute's worth is short-term memory, and then beyond that, long-term memory, we don't know the duration. We can have people who are 100 years old who can remember from when they were 10 years old, so 90 years ago, they can remember information. So in long-term memory, it can last a long time. There are differences in capacity. And I mentioned earlier, Bill, having worked with someone called Miller, and for any psychology student, they'll know about the phrase 7 plus or minus 2. And that was this magic phrase for how many numbers we can remember in our short-term memory. And it's about 7, give or take 2. And this is why our phone numbers are about 9 digits long, because that is the most we can remember. So our phone numbers have been created because of the capacity of short-term memory. The capacity of long-term memory, who knows? It's very big. But the most compelling evidence comes from amnesia. And we see patients like Clive who have problems with their memory. And the biggest clue that happened with this was a surgery that happened in Montreal. There's a young American man called Henry Molaison who, for students, became known as HM, because while a patient is still alive, we try to refer to them just by their initials. And Henry, who has passed away since then, had awful epilepsy that we knew emanated in his temporal lobes, so these areas here. And because of research that was being done at the time, it was decided that the only way to stop this awful epilepsy was to take out the areas of his brain that were damaged. And so he had what's known as a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy. So bilateral meant on both sides, temporal lobectomy because it's the temporal lobes here, and medial because it wasn't on the surface, it was deeper in, so on the middle part of the brain. And these are brain scans of Henry's brain, and the most telling one is the one here in the bottom right here. This is as if you were looking down onto Henry's head, so as if you'd sliced off over here. And what you see here, excuse me, what you see here is, this would be the side of Henry's head, his ears over here, and then as you go further in, this area of blackness here and here, this is the area that was removed because that was the area that was causing the epilepsy. Now, they managed to cure his epilepsy or reduce it substantially, but for the next 55 years, Henry didn't lay down another long-term memory. Henry was like Clive in that he could remember the last minute or so, but everything else was gone. And so we saw this extremely stark difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. And within the modal model, what that would suggest is that information is coming in through the senses, through the fingers, the eyes, the ears, etc. It's coming through the senses, it's going into short-term store, the short-term store, but it can't be transferred into long-term memory. And because it can't be transferred into long-term memory, everything is just pushed out, just as it was in Clive, so that he constantly thinks that he's just woken up. Excuse me. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about Nicola, who I worked with. She was about 62 years old at the time, and just like Clive, she suffered from encephalitis, and unfortunately, the day that she was taken to hospital, it was Christmas Day, and there was a skeletal staff. They thought it was just flu, and so it took a few days before she was diagnosed properly, but by that point, the damage had been done. And what you see here on in the scan, this is as if we're looking through Nicola's head like this, is that those areas of dark grey here are the areas of damage, again in those temporal lobes. And in this video, what I'm going to do is show you me speaking to Nicola, giving her a few words to remember, and see how you do in trying to remember these words. Some of you will remember this video from a previous talk. See how many words you can remember. Then I'm going to talk to Nicola for 45 seconds and then see how much she can remember after that. Right. Have you been on holiday recently?
I think so. We haven't, have we? Oh, we have. Oh, I beg pardon. I don't remember.
Okay. Nicola, I'm just going to try just a small memory test with you. Is that okay? Okay, I'm just going to read out 8 words to you, and what I'd like you to do is to just, when I'm finished,
repeat
whatever you can. Okay, so, are you ready? Okay. Table, lion, apple, shoe, carpet, robin, carrot, flower.
Table, apple, lion, shoe, flower. Can't remember anymore.
You did pretty well there. You got 5 out of 8. So
I got about 4.
well, you did better than Reg there. So well done. Okay, how are you at recognising people on TV? Do you watch much TV or films?
I watch television, don't I? And films.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recognise the people on the film?
I don't know, do I?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
What's your favourite programme?
EastEnders, I suppose. If we have it on.
So what's happening in EastEnders at the moment?
Well, I couldn't tell you.
Okay,
I'd have to wait for it to start, and then
it comes back.
I think, oh, so.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to those words that I gave you. Can you tell me what words I gave you?
No, I can't.
You remember one of them?
No.
Okay, now I'm just going to see how well the couch over there does. Okay.
Apple, lion, robin.
Robin, table.
Got 4, you see.
That's 4 again, yeah.
Fine,
That was between 2 of you then.
yeah.
Right,
2,
yes,
yeah.
you're
right.
So I've got 2, that's fine.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go to the bathroom. It's
Right.
just near
Just
the door,
round by
isn't it?
front, yeah.
Okay. If you guys just want to talk about what you did in Spain.
What we did is
Yeah. Tell Nicola about what you guys got up to in Spain.
You remember going to Spain? Yeah, you got back on
No, I don't remember going.
Thursday.
Tuesday night.
Tuesday.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Ash.
Hello. Have we met before?
I don't think so.
No. My name's Ash. Okay, so you saw there, I gave Nicola 7 or 8 words to remember, and when I asked her straight away after I'd said the last word, she remembered 5 out of the words, 5 out of 8 words, and if you remembered 5 or 6, you were doing okay. We saw that her husband, Reg, who wasn't expecting to be tested, remembered 4 out of the words. So that's about average. Now, what that suggests is that Nicola is fine taking information into that short-term memory, and as soon as I ask her what the words are, she can report back what's in there. But then I talked to her for 45 seconds about TV and things like that, and then went back to the words. And she couldn't remember a single word after that. And yet her husband, Reg, still remembered about 4 of the words. And do you remember what I said about the duration of short-term memory? It's about a minute at most. So what we see there is that when I give her the 8 words, Nicola can hold that information in there for about a minute's worth. But then as I speak to her a bit more, and I speak to her about TV, etc., anything that's held in the short-term memory, because her brain is damaged, the medial temporal lobes and the hippocampus damaged, what happens is that there's nowhere for that information to go, so it gets lost and she can't remember a single word. And then you saw that I went out of the room, came back 2 minutes later, and she didn't know who I was. And that is probably the most profound example of memory you'll ever see, because Nicola and Clive and HM are as extreme as you could get. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how that stark difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. Now I'm going to turn to a different type of memory problem, and this was work that I did with a young man called Anthony, who I know is watching right now. Anthony's GP was actually a student of mine a number of years ago for the Open University, and Teresa, the GP, she said that she had a young man in her practice who had suffered a horrific head injury. He'd fallen down a delivery chute about 23 feet onto his head, and he was very fortunate not to have been killed. He ended up having extensive damage to his brain, and particularly to the front of the brain. And he survived, amazingly. But after recovery, he complained of memory problems. But his weren't like Nicola's or Clive's. They were within his short-term memory, but no problems in his long-term memory. And these happened to occur when he was stressed and if he was talking to a number of people at once. And he found that when he went back to university after recovering for a year, he found it really difficult to take notes in a lecture at the same time as listening to the lecturer. So he could listen and absorb, or he could write, but if he tried to do both together, he was lost. So I actually ended up writing a letter for him for his university to explain the memory problems that he was experiencing, and he was given a scribe for that. Excuse me. And Anthony has survived. He's a successful young man, and this, in fact, is me at his wedding last year with his beautiful bride, Stephanie. And what you see is that Anthony is a successful young man. He's able to live a life in a way in which Nicola and Clive and HM were not able to. So it seems that this type of problem has a different impact. I'm going to have to take a throat lozenge, excuse me. Now, if I sound like I've got something in my mouth, it's because I've got something in my mouth, but it's only so that I don't have a coughing fit at you. So what we have here is that we have 2 patients. Nicola, who had her short-term memory was fine. She could hold on to those 5 words very easily, but her long-term memory was very impaired. And Anthony, who has a bad short-term memory and an okay long-term memory. And for those of you who are interested, and certainly the students should be, This represents what we call a double dissociation, where we've got two patients who are exactly the opposite of one another. And what that tells us is a really profoundly important thing, that short-term memory and long-term memory are separate and that they're almost parallel processes. And what that allows us to see is that memory is at least two different things, short-term memory and long-term memory. Then when we move into what the structure of long-term memory is, philosophers such as Ryle used to talk about this, and they used to talk about the difference between knowing how to do something, such as riding a bicycle, and knowing what about something, so what a bicycle is. And this distinction was then adopted by researchers such as Larry Squire and Neil Cohen, and they referred to skill-based learning as procedural memory and fact-based learning as declarative memory. And if you remember, Clive was able to play the piano, and that's a really important thing, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, as an example of this, there's a fiendish task known as the mirror drawing task. And in the mirror drawing task, a subject is given two stars like this, one star inside the other, and their task is to draw a medium-sized star, so basically a star in the middle between the two stars. And every time their pencil or pen touches either of the two stars, they have an error. Now, it's difficult enough as it is, but to make it more difficult, you can't see your own hand. So this is a photograph of me doing the mirror drawing task. And what you see is my hand here in the front. I can't see it because this is in front of me. All I can see is the reflection of my hand. Now, anyone who's tried to write with their left hand or looked in the mirror while you're trying to write will see how disconcerting that is. So it's a difficult task to do, and you have to learn how to take feedback from your eyes in a different way. Excuse me. The reason I'm showing you this is because HM, the young man who'd had his temporal lobes removed because of his epilepsy, was given this task by the researchers who were working with him. And you see in this graph on the left-hand side, his performance on the first day with going from his first attempt where he, if you see the y-axis is the number of errors he made on each attempt. The first time he did this, he made about 30 errors. And trust me, having done this, he was doing well to only make 30 errors. But what you see is that as he went through the day, his number of errors was reducing. So by the end of the day, on his 10th go, he was scoring about 4 or 5 errors. On the second day, he started with about 12 errors, but then by the end of that day, it was only about 3 errors. And on the third day, he was making about 2 or 3 errors. Now, I would say, and I'm sure you would agree, that HM had learned this task. He was really good at it. But if HM was ever asked, have you seen this before? He'd say, nope. Have you ever done this before? No. Do you remember when we did this with you before? Nope. So what you have there is that his ability to do something, learn this task and remember how to do it is really good, because we see that by the end of by the third day, he's nailed it. And yet his ability to remember whether or not he's done it has gone. And that's a very profound difference. And an important thing is that we find that skills that were learned before the amnesia tends to be intact. So in Clive's case, he used to be able to play the piano. He can still play the piano. But importantly, the fact that we can teach new skills, so we can teach HM the mirror drawing task, and he's able to do that, is really important. And that's important for rehabilitation. So I'm going to come back to that next in the next talk in terms of trying to help people with amnesia. So what we see here is that distinction between procedural and declarative memory. And knowing that in amnesia, for people like Clive, HM, and Nicola, procedural memory is actually intact. Then moving into declarative memory, the big daddy of memory research, Endel Tulving, he's like the godfather of everything. He drew a distinction within declarative memory between what he called episodic memory, which is memory for events. So when you last rode a bicycle, for example, and semantic memory, so memory for fact. So what is a bicycle? Define what a bicycle is. And the reason that he did this was because he was trying to understand amnesia. And what he said was that we know that the short-term memory in these people is intact. We know their procedural memory is intact. So where is the problem? And so he said the problem must be within declarative memory, and it must be within this episodic side of things, because these patients can tell you what a bicycle is, so their semantic memory is okay, but they can't tell you when they last rode a bicycle, which is their episodic memory. So to summarize, we start off with this one big thing, the Madeleine's and Proust's memory, called memory. And we can split that into short-term memory and long-term memory. So short-term memory might be me giving you my office phone number. Long-term memory, we know, splits into two: procedural memory for skills, such as playing a guitar, and declarative memory for facts. And we know that declarative memory splits into two: episodic memory, such as events. So this is my birthday cake from my 50th birthday. And yes, it is a brain. I am that much of a nerd that I asked for a brain cake. And semantic memory, such as Einstein's famous equation about relativity. And so what you see here is the complexity of human memory. And this is a very simplistic description. So there's much more to it than this, but this is what I use to help students explain the differences between different aspects of memory. And as a neuropsychologist, what's really important to me is which bits of a patient's memory are intact. And what we find is that their short-term memory and their procedural memory are intact. And next time I'll also tell you about a different type of memory, implicit memory, which is also intact, but because of time, I won't be able to go into that. So to summarize, we know that memory is complex and forgetting is natural. And memory is broken up into a number of different parts, and that can break down with different types of neuropsychological disorders. So I'm going to tell you more in the next talk, and that's where I'm going to take forward some of the things that I've said today, but then bring in the issue of dementia, because that is a time bomb waiting to go off in terms of the fact that dementia diagnoses are increasing, but we still have no pharmacological treatments for dementia. So it's something that we really need to understand. So that I'm going to spend a bit more time with dementia next time. So finally, I just want to tell you about the studies that my group does, in case there are any researchers or clinicians out there who are interested, or people who want to take part in our studies. And that includes A-level schools, because a lot of our research can include A-level students. So if you're a school teacher or you're studying psychology, feel free to get in touch. We've got a number of studies on human memory, including a new test that we've developed that we think is going to be able to diagnose dementia earlier than current tests. And we've got a project at the moment translating it in different languages. We've got my face recognition study looking at both acquired and developmental prosopagnosia and trying to improve diagnosis of prosopagnosia in children. Then the work that we're doing on executive functions, which is the way the front of the brain manages behavior across a whole load of things, from our development through adolescence, developmental disorders, the impact of drugs, and possibly even the involvement of childhood head injuries and later criminal behavior. And then we've got Pedro's work on using music to improve memory rehabilitation, movement rehabilitation even. You can tell I'm exhausted. If you're interested in any of this work, then please get in touch with either myself or my student Claudia, c.pulcini@goal.ac.uk. The first question I've got here is regarding flashbulb memories, and this from Denise Halterman. Is it stronger because of the bond of the experience and the strong emotions linked with these experiences? Yes, flashbulb memories, or memory generally, we know that emotion plays a huge part in our memories, because there must be a reason why, from an evolutionary perspective, things that are very arousing, either scary or exciting, need to be remembered. So there's some sort of mechanism whereby the emotion of an experience tends to make them more memorable, and so that plays a huge part. And in fact, in my PhD, that was what I was looking at in terms of the reminiscence bump. So why is it that those memories are remembered? And part of it is because they're first time experiences. It's the first kiss, the first leaving home, the first job, the first foreign holiday, etc. And because there's an emotion attached to those very early experiences, we think that contributes. And with the flashbulb memory, just like a very traumatic personal experience, that's why we think that the flashbulb memories have that. We think also that one of the things about flashbulb memories is that they're shared experiences. So my experience of my first kiss or my first foreign holiday was something that only I experienced and maybe one other person. But 9/11 was experienced by everyone, and it's talked about a lot. And this is part of what Bill was looking at in his work, that why are they remembered so well? And we think part of it is because we talk about things a lot. If you talked about a particular event, such as how you brushed your teeth this morning constantly, you would have a really good memory of it. But we don't tend to talk about how we brushed our teeth this morning over and over and over and over again. But in the time just after 9/11, that's the only thing everyone talked about. So for that reason, there's a lot of what we call rehearsal of this repeated talking about it, and that also strengthens the memory. So part of the reason that these flashbulb memories are so strong is because of the emotion involved, but also the fact that everyone is bloody well talking about it. Okay, so Denise had also asked, is it the same thing that happens with eyewitnesses? Somewhat, again, emotion is involved. So when you see a crime or something like that, part of it is about the emotion. But of course, if it's incidental, we don't really know that. The next question is from Natasha Ganya. I hope I've said your name properly. Natasha has asked how unsettled Clive was when he saw his wife. How well do we understand the emotional impact of amnesia? It's a really good question, and unfortunately we don't understand it. And part of this is that in these forms of brain damage, as well as the area that I highlighted, so there's medial temporal lobes, the disorders such as the herpes simplex, etc., they're not just destroying those areas, they're destroying other areas as well. And even in HM's case, where it was surgery, I spent 7 hours in neurosurgical theatre watching a temporal lobectomy happen. And it's an imprecise art because the surgeon is kind of needing to guess where he's taking things, because you can't do a brain scan while you're doing the actual surgery. So they're having to use a lot of knowledge to try to hope that they're getting the right areas. So the surgery is damaging other areas that the surgeon might not want to damage, and the skill of a really good surgeon is to take out the damaged areas and not damage anything else. With natural diseases and other disorders, the degenerative ones, etc., it seldom is just one area that's damaged. There tends to be widespread damage. And so it's probably the case that in these disorders where there's the emotional impact, that maybe some of the emotional areas are affected as well. It might be also that there's an insight, so such that some patients have got insight about their problem and others don't. So Nicola didn't seem to be that impacted or upset about her memory problem. She knew she had one, but she didn't have the same level of insight as Clive did. I've worked with patients with the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, and they tend to show very little insight. So it varies a lot. So unfortunately, we don't yet understand it. And as I effectively demonstrated in my talk, why do we know less about the human brain than the dark side of the moon? It's a very new science, so that's why we don't really know. Okay, so the next question is from Nayanika Sengupta from India, I think. She asked, why does the procedural memory, for example, playing piano in the case of Clive, why isn't it affected? The simple reason for that is that we believe that the areas that are involved in storing our motor memories of those things, such as the mirror drawing or the piano playing, etc., is in a different part of the brain, and it's not in the areas that are responsible for storing a memory, such as the last time I rode a bicycle this time last year. So given that it's a different area of the brain that's involved, it's not affected by the brain damage. And in fact, we know that in Parkinson's, for example, you can have a double dissociation where we have these patients who can remember the last time they rode a bicycle, but they can't ride the bicycle, and it's because the damage is in a different part of the brain. So that's why we believe that procedural memory is intact in these patients. Lola Sakar, oh hello mum, that's Andrea's mum in Dubai. She asked, in Clive's case, what is the time frame between identification of the virus till it becomes beyond repair? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer, but I do know that in both Clive's case and Nicola's case, it was a long time. In Clive's case, it was I think it was weeks before they worked it out. In Nicola's case, it was a number of days. But Sandra, who I think may be listening, but I'm not sure, when her husband Lee worked out that there was something wrong and he took her to the hospital, Sandra was really fortunate because a nurse that was on duty had recently been on a course in which they talked about encephalitis, which is basically a swelling of the brain. And she realized that this wasn't a flu, that what Sandra was exhibiting was something else. And so it's kind of like someone going to a doctor a couple of months ago and with breathing problems, and someone saying that's not asthma, that looks like the symptoms of coronavirus. So Sandra was lucky in that respect. So I don't know what the time frame is. I think that once the damage is done, it's done. It's just that it's the extent of the damage. So Sandra's medial temporal lobes didn't get damaged as much as Nicola's or Clive's. So Sandra didn't have anything near as bad a problem as either of them. And Sandra, until recently, worked independently. She drove a car, etc. So whereas Clive or Nicola were never going to ever do anything independently, Sandra was able to, and part of that was because her encephalitis was caught early. So I don't think it was because of repair, it was because of limited damage. Okay. So the next question is from Deb Gadgich, I think who's an A-level student or is teaching A-level, I'm not sure. And she said that in all of the A-level psychology textbooks, they say that HM's hippocampus was destroyed. Yes, Deb, I did that deliberately because I didn't want it to become a neuroanatomy lesson, so I talked about the temporal lobes, which are these areas here. But so that everyone else knows, this whole area is called the temporal lobes. But that area that was about an inch in, which is that area that was scooped out by the neurosurgeon, that is an area called the hippocampus, and that is memory central. And so it's the hippocampus that was mainly destroyed in the neurosurgery in HM, and also the same area that was damaged in Clive and Nicola, and to some extent in Sandra. So Sana Barakat asks, you hear the term of someone having a good memory or a poor one. Do memories differ from one person to another? Is it genetically driven, personality driven, etc.? Or do people decide to make certain memories dominant selectively? What are some of the causes that memories differ between people? It's certainly not. It's certainly not a choice issue. I don't think it's genetic either. Probably personality. Part of me showing the kind of multiplicity of memory was to demonstrate that memory is many different things. Now, in the second part of this talk, I'll go into some ways of improving memory, and what you'll notice there is that part of it is what we do with information. So it may be that some people are not paying enough attention. Some people don't have the skill yet. They haven't been taught how to remember things. So these are quite higher level issues, but there are many differences between people. And if you want to see my previous talk, which is called Confabulation, Capgras and Cotards, in that I talk a bit about the variation human memory, and we all differ, just as we all differ in terms of our running abilities. And I'm never going to win a gold medal in 100 meters sprinting, and I can still run. So we all differ. And so in terms of memory, there are some people who are the equivalent of the 100 meters champions, and there's others who are not. The reasons are very many and multifarious. So I think I would say that it's a complex answer. Barbara Georgelis, I think, has asked, is there an explanation as to why Clive can remember his wife, which is an episodic memory, but not his children and other people from his past? It is an anomaly I have difficulty explaining when covering this subject with my students. So from that, I guess that Barbara is teaching psychology, I think. Yes, the reason for this is because of the fact that it's not all of memory that's it's not long-term memory that's destroyed in patients. It's the ability to create new long-term memories. So it's a case, the closest analogy I can give, it's only an analogy, it's not the same thing. The closest analogy I can give is that it's like a computer which is now, where the hard disk can't take any more information because of some sort of fault. You might still be able to use the computer to send emails and things like that, but you can't store anything new on it. So the memories of Deborah, Clive's wife, they're on the hard drive and they're accessible. So when Clive sees his wife, his memories are from having seen her years ago, not from seeing her that morning. That's why he cries, because he thinks that he hasn't seen her for a long time. In terms of his children, I don't know the details of that, but what I would say is that the damage will have affected part of the hard drive, and we know that it's not the case that the hard drive is completely okay. The hard drive is damaged as well. And we don't know to what extent. And that actually is something that has been vexing and puzzling neuropsychologists for a while, in terms of trying to understand how much damage there is. So initially it was thought, for example, that HM's long-term memory, or his previous memories, were completely okay, but in fact, that's not the case. So it's actually effectively the reason that Clive can remember his wife and have that emotional response is because he's got a memory from her from many years ago, from the bit of the hard drive that's still working. Okay. So Priyanka Day, who I think is in Kolkata, says, I have these memories from a time and place that I've not been a part of, and these memories have been consistently present for years. I've always been curious about how these memories have come to exist, if the situations about which these memories have formed have never existed. So that's an interesting question. So Priyanka is saying that she's got these possibly vivid memories of events that she knows she hasn't taken part in. There is work on déjà vu where people have a sense of something already having happened. I don't know how that works. I think, and this is me really just going out on a limb here, I think part of it is about that reconstructive element of human memory where I try to think about what I could have done last year for my birthday, and then I create a memory that is hopefully 70% correct. I think that maybe what's happening in deja vu is that this reconstruction is happening, and there's a sense of familiarity for something that didn't actually happen. But that is actually just an intuition. It's not because of anything I've read or know about. So if I'm talking complete rubbish, then do write to me and let me know so that I never talk that rubbish again. Okay. Denise Holterman is on fire. Denise has asked another question, which is another question related to false memories. Are there, from suggestions or experience of others, that are retained in a part of the brain that makes you think it happened to you, abuse in some instances? That's a very interesting question. So there is an issue to do with false memories and recovered false memories of child sex abuse. And this is, as you can imagine, a really contentious issue. We know that memory is fallible, as you will have seen in the talk I gave last week about memory and confabulation, etc. And we know that memory is a reconstructive process. We know from the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who's the grand dame of eyewitness memory research, that memory can be altered. So a good barrister, for example, during cross-examination can make someone in court of law think that something happened by the types of questions they ask. So if that can happen for an event that is not personal, then it's also possible for this to happen for more for deeper level and negative issues such as childhood sex abuse. As you can imagine, this is incredibly contentious, and I actually know Elizabeth Loftus, and she's had a number of death threats because of her testifying in court about the fallibility of human memory and the fact that some cases of childhood sex abuse couldn't have happened. So it's a contentious issue. I would say, just from my knowledge of the fallibility of memory, that yes, some of these false memories are because of a knowledge of something that could have happened but didn't actually happen. And at some levels, it's kind of linked to Priyanka's question about deja vu, or maybe it wasn't Priyanka. Yeah, it was Priyanka's question about deja vu and about confabulation. So again, complex issues, but I think that it is possible that these memories aren't real. Next question is from Stephanie Sugden, whose wedding photograph you've just seen. So Stephanie asks, is there any research, or would you be interested in some research, into why and how women go through childbirth more than once? There's an old midwife's tale that women forget how bad it can be, but I don't know if there's any proof to back this up. That's a great question, Stephanie, because from the women I know who've had children, some of them said, how could you not forget how bloody painful it is? To be honest, I don't know the answers. I think part of it is the reconstructive nature of memory. That unless it's an incredibly traumatic birth, I think the pain of labor and giving birth, etc., is probably forgotten because of the enormous endorphin rush and the oxytocin that's involved in the feel-good factor of having given birth. And I think that the negative aspect of it is forgotten really quickly. And I think that this in a way must be evolutionary, because if it was that traumatic, then you'd say never again. And every woman would just have one child and that's it. And we know that that's not the case. I'm one of 6. So there must be a reason that women can go through it. And the thing is, just kind of like the way that we differ in our memory processes, I imagine that there are some women who say, yeah, it was fine. Didn't hurt. So there must be some women for whom childbirth wasn't that difficult. If there is anyone listening for whom childbirth was a breeze, please do say so that I can at least say I wasn't talking complete rubbish. But thank you, Stephanie. So Sana Barakat asked another question, which is a layperson question. But in a nutshell, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's, and will new research on dementia that you've mentioned provide insight? Well, there isn't a difference between dementia and Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a dementia. It is one of the dementias. It's not a different thing. It's just the best known dementia. We're doing research to try to help with diagnosing Alzheimer's. In terms of curing, no way. No way. At the moment, I mean, I'm known for straight talking and not making things up. But I'm not going to pretend that there's any hope at the moment of curing Alzheimer's. The best we can do at the moment is to manage it and diagnose it as early as possible. The work that I know of, and I'm not an expert in the area, the work that I know of is to try to diagnose as early as possible and to arrest the degeneration, because it's a degenerative process that's getting worse and worse over time. And the idea is that if you can catch it at an early enough stage, you can plateau it so it doesn't get any worse. But if you catch it really late as it's going down here, there's very little to plateau. Whereas if we catch it up here when it's, let's say, this is 100%, this is 70%, 50%, etc. If we can catch it at 70% and we can plateau it, then we can keep someone at this level. Whereas if at the moment we're catching it when it's at 30%, then there's very little of the person left. And this is why the research that Terry and I are doing with our test ValMT is really important, because we're not trying to cure Alzheimer's, we're trying to catch it earlier. And if we can catch it earlier, then we can try to preserve as much of the person as possible. But we're not going to preserve that person. That's pharmacology and biochemistry that's going to do that. We're cognitive neuropsychologists trying to develop understanding of the disorder. We're not going to be able to cure it or stop it. I'm sorry for sounding negative, but I believe it's really important that people understand what it is that is possible and what isn't possible. And at the moment, curing Alzheimer's is nowhere near on the radar. Okay, next question is from Jonathan Gossage, who I think, if I'm right, Jonathan, you're in Canada, aren't you? Okay, so this is a nice question. Jonathan asks, do you know of any research on the possibility that long-term memories may actually exist but not be retrievable? I'm thinking of situations when someone can remember episodes that occurred maybe 70 years ago, but only now could anything related to that episode be retrieved? That's a really interesting question, Jonathan. And I think that this kind of goes back to the reminiscence bump, and the fact that memory is a reconstructive process, and also those cakes. That if if the information is there, then it's a case of trying to find it. So one of the big questions in memory and forgetting is the forgetting because that trace, the memory, has just been destroyed, or is it that we can't find it? And your question lends itself to the second hypothesis that when we can't find information, we say forgotten, but is it that it's forgotten at the moment, and that under different circumstances we might be able to find it? Now, it's not the same thing, but an example would be tip of the tongue. Tip of the tongue is when someone asks you a question about that person who's on TV in Game of Thrones or whatever, and you think, yes, I know that person's name, and you're thinking, and it's here, but you can't remember the name. You know it, but you can't find it at the moment. And I think that your example of not being able to remember something, and then suddenly at some point later in life, having these memories again, is an example not of tip of the tongue, but the fact that now your ability to recreate that memory, because of the reconstructive nature of memory, is possible. We can't prove that, but I think that we've got enough different forms of understanding for me to say that with a certain degree of confidence that yes, those memories could possibly be there, and it's just that they're not being found. And I think that there are things that are happening as we get older which make some of those earlier memories come to the fore, and that's kind of what I was looking at in my PhD. Next question from Stephanie again, Mrs. Sugden. Have any links been found between certain parts of the brain and short and long-term memory? So Anthony's brain scan mentioned damage to the frontal lobes, but with the case study you mentioned it was temporal lobe. Great question, Stephanie, there. So yes, basically. So we believe that memory starts off here short-term memory is information that the front of the brain is processing right now. So what you're seeing and hearing right now is coming in, and the front of the brain, the manager is doing the, oh, what am I seeing, what am I hearing, etc., and putting it together so that you can understand it. But then we believe that that information is sent to this area here, to the medial temporal lobes, and that horseshoe-shaped structure called the hippocampus, and that's what puts it together in a process that we call binding, and it binds that information together so that people can now remember when I say, remember the photograph I showed of Anthony and Stephanie's wedding. That is bound now, and it's in this part of the brain, and the hippocampus is doing that. And the hippocampus then finds a place after it's knitted it together to say, okay, I'm going to put you over there. And so that's happening in the temporal lobes. So Anthony's damage is here, which is affecting the short-term memory at some level, and the damage in Nicola, Clive, and HM is here in the ability to put it into long-term memory. So yes, temporal lobes are for long-term memory, frontal lobes more for short-term memory, but it's a tiny bit more than that, but that's the easiest answer I can give. Okay, so Lola, mummy again, is asking, is there a specific test one has to take that identifies presence of memory-related malfunctions? No, there isn't. As you saw, memory is extremely complicated, and as a result of that, it's there isn't one way of testing it. Memory is many different things. So we have different tests for short-term to long-term memory, for episodic, semantic. Within short-term memory, we have tests for visual memory and verbal memory and visuospatial memory. And we have tests for how you recognize things, compared to how you remember it without any clues. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of tests. So one of the things that I often find in my in bad work that I see, or bad comments from people, is that they think that because of one test they can diagnose something. That's just not possible. There are some things where there is one gold standard diagnostic test, and that from that one test you'll know whether you've got X, Y, Z. So maybe for the coronavirus or HIV or whatever. But for cognitive things, we don't understand these skills well enough to have one standard test. And so we can't have one test of memory, because that would imply memory was one thing, and we know that memory is not one thing, as you saw from that memory tree of all the different types of memory that I showed at the end. So so no, it basically depends on what type of memory we're referring to. Okay, the next question is from Paul Jenkins. Hello, Paul. Paul has said that he had encephalitis aged 5, then in his early 40s, and he had corrective surgery on his hippocampus to cure epilepsy. Was it one of these or both that caused the prosopagnosia? And this is because I started chatting to Paul on a Facebook prosopagnosia group, because Paul has got prosopagnosia, which is the face recognition disorder. Now, I don't know the prosopagnosia, so memory for faces, is different from amnesia. So I don't believe that the epilepsy and the corrective surgery will have caused that, because the area that we think is affected in prosopagnosia is a bit further back in the brain. So unless the surgery also affected that area, I don't think that would have caused your prosopagnosia. What would be, now you do say in your question that it was your hippocampus that was affected. So it depends on how much of your hippocampus was affected. So I know that you've done some of the tests that Claudia has sent you for your prosopagnosia. If it's possible to get the records of your surgery, we can look to see whether it was just the hippocampus or areas further back that were affected. So this is an example of where it's really important to know whether it's memory that's affected, or face memory that's affected, or both. And this is quite a technical issue. So sometimes I would say this person's inability to remember faces is because they've got amnesia. And you saw that that Nicola couldn't remember who I was, but Nicola had this massive amnesia, and so it had nothing to do with my face. It was because she can't remember anything for more than a minute, whether it's a face or a cat. A cat's got a face, by the way. But other people might not remember a face simply because of their prosopagnosia, but they can remember their name, the conversation, etc. So teasing those things apart is a really important thing, and it's the kind of research that we do in my group, and I know that you're interested, so I'd like to delve deeper into your brain, metaphorically speaking, of course. I've got one final question here by, well, I think it's a reply from Jonathan Gossage, which is that I think that memory retrieval is very highly correlated with the particular complex of emotions associated with the memory. Yes, memory and emotion are very closely linked together. If I experience something with a kind of like, I can't be bothered look on my face, and with a kind of like, yeah, I'm not really paying attention, then all of the software in the brain that is looking at this information and trying to knit it together, etc., isn't getting any useful information. But if I'm glued to the computer like this, or to the music, and it's evoking emotions in me, either huge passion or huge dread, then that's going to mean that the hippocampus is getting lots of lovely information to knit together. So yes, emotion is very highly linked to memory. We don't think it's the only thing, because some of the work that Bill, the lovely, amazing Bill in New York did, was about the emotion that people had about 9/11, and it doesn't seem that the emotion was good enough to keep their memories together. So while emotion is important, it's not the only thing, and this kind of answers one of the other questions about the kind of the individual differences between different people in memory. If it was just one thing, such as emotion, then we'd just say that person remembers well because they're quite emotional. That person's got a rubbish memory because they're unemotional. But we know that that it's not as simple as that. Some people are very visual and they can see details in the visual scene and they remember those things. So visual information is important. Some people process information more deeply, and that's called levels of processing, which I'll talk about next time as well. So there are a lot of different elements that go into a memory trace: the visuals, the hearing, the amount of thinking that you do, and the emotion. And there are also things to do with your physical state. If I was trying to give a talk or trying to remember something last night, I was toast. I'd had a 13-hour day, so hardly anything was going in. And so my physical state meant that I couldn't take that information in. And then if I'm hypoglycemic because I haven't eaten properly, then that can affect things as well. So there's all these different factors that impact the way you're taking the information in. And then we also know, and I talked about this in one of the previous talks, that the state that you're in when you try to remember something is also really important for how you remember. So there's been some rather fruity experiments. This was before research ethics was a big thing, where in the States they taught some students information while having a marijuana joint, or not having a marijuana joint, or having a joint which didn't have any marijuana in it. And then they tested them later on, either while they were high again on marijuana or not high. And what they found is that the people who'd learned something while they were on marijuana actually remembered it better while they were again on marijuana later on. If you taught someone something while on marijuana and then tested them sober, they didn't remember as well. So there's the state that you're in when you remember, which also impacts your memory, and then there's your emotional state as well. So there's all these things about what this situation is like when you process information initially, and then also what happens later on, and then all sorts of things in between as well. So this is why I say memory is so fascinating and complex, because of all these different things going on. Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of Saturday and stay safe. Goodbye.